The telegram arrived on a Thursday morning, 3 days after Margaret Whitmore's husband struck her for the last time. She stood in the Boston Telegraph office with a split lip and bruised ribs, reading words that promised salvation from a man named Samuel Crawford in Montana Territory. He needed a wife. She needed to disappear before Thomas killed her. The arrangement seemed simple enough, though Margaret knew nothing about Montana except that it was far from the brownstone where she had become a ghost of herself. She sold her mother's pearl earrings, packed a single carpetbag, and boarded the westbound train with $23 sewn into her petticoat. Nobody asked questions about the fingerprint bruises on her throat. Nobody ever did. The journey took 11 days. Margaret watched America transform outside her window from crowded cities to endless prairie. Other passengers spoke to her, but she kept her responses brief, her eyes downcast. 5 years of marriage had taught her that being noticed was dangerous. Being forgotten was survival. She rehearsed her story until it felt true. Her husband had died of influenza. She was alone in the world. She wanted a fresh start. The lies tasted bitter, but they were safer than the truth. Samuel's letters had been kind, describing his ranch and his need for companionship after his first wife's death. He seemed decent. Margaret had learned that seeming and being were different things, but she had run out of choices. Montana would have to be far enough. The train deposited her in Billings on a cold April afternoon. Samuel Crawford was supposed to meet her at the station. Margaret waited on the platform with her carpetbag, scanning faces for someone matching his description. Tall, he had written. Fair-haired. 42 years old. The crowd thinned as families reunited and travelers found their connections. An hour passed. Then 2. The sun began its descent toward the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Margaret's stomach twisted with familiar dread. She had traveled halfway across the country to meet a stranger who might not want her after all. Perhaps he had taken one look and changed his mind. Perhaps this had been a terrible mistake. A sheriff approached as evening fell. He was weathered and gray, with eyes that had seen too much. He asked if she was waiting for someone. Margaret explained about Samuel Crawford, about the arrangement, about coming from Boston. The sheriff's expression shifted from curiosity to something darker. He removed his hat and held it against his chest. There had been an accident 2 weeks prior. Samuel's horse had spooked crossing a river. The current had been strong from the spring melt. They had found his body 3 days later. Margaret stood very still as the world tilted sideways. The sheriff was still talking, saying something about the ranch, about Samuel's debts, about having nowhere to send her. She heard the words from a great distance, as though she were underwater. She had spent her last money getting here. Thomas would kill her if she returned. She had no family, no friends who would risk his anger by taking her in. The frontier had seemed like freedom, but now it felt like the edge of the earth, and she was falling. The sheriff offered her a bed at the boarding house for one night. After that, she would need to find work or move on. Margaret nodded numbly. She followed him through streets turned purple with dusk, past saloons where piano music spilled into the evening air, past storefronts closing for the night. The boarding house smelled of lye soap and boiled cabbage. Her room was small and spare, with a narrow bed and a washstand. She sat on the edge of the mattress as darkness gathered in the corners. She had escaped one trap only to fall into another. Tomorrow she would need to decide whether to stay in this strange town or use her remaining coins for passage to somewhere else, somewhere that might be worse. She pressed her hands against her face and allowed herself, for the first time since leaving Boston, to cry. Morning brought cruel clarity. Margaret counted her remaining money at the washstand while gray light filtered through thin curtains. $17.32. Not enough for passage back east, even if she had anywhere to go. The boarding house keeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Hadley, informed her that the room was $2 per week, payable immediately. Margaret paid, watching her safety net shrink. She needed work, and she needed it quickly. Billings was a rough town built on cattle and commerce, where respectable positions for women were scarce. The sheriff had mentioned a seamstress who might need help, and the hotel sometimes hired cleaning girls. Margaret donned her best dress, the gray wool that hid stains well, and ventured into streets still damp with morning dew. The seamstress position had been filled the previous day. The hotel needed no one. The general store owner looked her up and down with eyes that made her skin crawl and suggested she might find more lucrative work at the saloon. Margaret left quickly, her cheeks burning with shame and anger. She walked the length of the main street twice, gathering her courage to enter establishments that might employ her. A restaurant owner said business was slow. The school teacher already had an assistant. By noon, Margaret's hope had worn thin as the soles of her boots. She sat on a bench outside the livery stable, wondering how quickly $17 would disappear and what would happen when it did. The Montana sky stretched impossibly blue overhead, indifferent to her suffering. She had survived Thomas for 5 years. She would survive this too, though she could not yet imagine how. A commotion drew her attention toward the edge of town. Riders approached from the north, perhaps a dozen of them, moving with a purpose that made townspeople stop and stare. Margaret stood, shading her eyes against the bright sun. The riders were different from the ranchers and cowboys she had seen. They sat their horses with a fluid grace that suggested they had been born in the saddle. As they drew closer, Margaret realized with a start that they were Indians. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Everything she had heard about Indians came from Boston newspapers that painted them as savages, though the people approaching looked neither savage nor threatening. They moved with quiet dignity, their horses well kept, their bearing proud despite the suspicious glances from townspeople who stepped back to let them pass. The man leading them commanded attention without demanding it. He rode a paint stallion with distinctive markings, sitting straight-backed in a way that spoke of natural authority. He was younger than Margaret expected, perhaps 35, with strong features and dark hair that fell past his shoulders. He wore a mix of traditional and white man's clothing, leather leggings beneath a worn cotton shirt, a beaded vest that caught the sunlight. His eyes swept the street with careful assessment, noting the hostile faces, the hands that moved toward holstered guns, the women who pulled their children close. Those eyes found Margaret still standing by the livery stable, the only person who had not retreated. For a moment their gazes locked. His expression was unreadable, but something in it made Margaret think of a wolf assessing unfamiliar territory, alert to danger, ready to protect his pack. The group stopped outside the trading post. The leader dismounted in one smooth motion and entered the building while his companions waited. Margaret noticed how they positioned themselves, seemingly casual but actually watchful, protecting each other's backs. She should have looked away, should have moved along like everyone else, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Perhaps it was recognition of a kind. They were outsiders here, just as she was. They moved carefully through hostile spaces, just as she had learned to do. The leader emerged from the trading post carrying supplies, his jaw tight with barely contained frustration. Whatever transaction had occurred inside had not been pleasant. He secured the goods to his horse and prepared to mount. Then his eyes found Margaret again. This time he paused, studying her with an intensity that should have frightened her but somehow did not. He crossed the street with long strides, his companions tensing behind him. Margaret's pulse raced, but she did not run. Running had never saved her before. He stopped a respectful distance away, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough to avoid threatening her. When he spoke, his English was accented but clear, his voice low and measured. He asked if she was well. The question was so unexpected that Margaret nearly laughed. Nobody had asked her that in years, and certainly no stranger had ever shown such direct concern. She must have looked as desperate as she felt, sitting alone outside a livery stable with nowhere to go. She told him the truth before she could think better of it. She was new to town. She had no employment. She was alone. His dark eyes studied her face, and she had the unsettling sensation that he saw more than the bruises that had faded to yellow-green shadows on her jaw. He saw the fear she carried like a second skin, the exhaustion that went bone-deep, the desperation she tried to hide beneath forced composure. He introduced himself as Metawatakpi, which meant charging bear, though white men called him Thomas Bear. He was Lakota, from the reservation north of town. He spoke carefully, as though weighing each word for potential misunderstanding. His people needed someone to teach the children English, someone to help them navigate the increasingly necessary interactions with white authorities and traders. The Indian agent had refused to provide a teacher. Would she be willing to come to the reservation? The salary would be modest but include room and board. Margaret's mind reeled. She knew nothing about teaching. She knew less about Indians. Everything in her Boston upbringing screamed that this was dangerous, inappropriate, possibly suicidal. But Thomas Bear watched her with patient eyes that held neither pity nor judgment, simply an offer that asked nothing more than an answer. Behind him, his companions waited in tense silence, aware that the townspeople were watching this interaction with open hostility. Margaret thought of her dwindling money, of Mrs. Hadley's boarding house and what would happen when she could no longer pay. She thought of the general store owner's leering suggestion and all the ways a woman alone could be devoured by desperation. She met Thomas Bear's eyes and heard herself say yes. The ride north took most of the afternoon. Margaret sat behind Thomas Bear on his paint stallion, her carpet bag secured behind them, acutely aware of the solid warmth of his back and the easy way he controlled the powerful horse. The other riders flanked them in a loose formation, speaking occasionally in their own language, voices rising and falling in rhythms Margaret could not follow. She caught curious glances directed her way, but no hostility. They seemed more interested than suspicious, though she imagined they were wondering what kind of white woman would agree to come to their reservation with strangers. She wondered the same thing herself. The familiar terror that had lived in her chest for 5 years had been joined by a different sensation, something that felt almost like hope, though she barely recognized it anymore. The landscape transformed as they traveled. The rough grasslands gave way to rolling hills, then to a valley where a river curved like a silver ribbon through cottonwood groves. The reservation land was more beautiful than Margaret had imagined, though she could see signs of hardship in the worn teepees and the thin cattle grazing sparse pastures. Children spotted them first, running to greet the returning riders with shouts of excitement. Women emerged from dwellings, their faces lighting with relief at seeing their men return safely. Margaret felt their eyes turn to her, curiosity sharpening to surprise when they realized she was not a captive but apparently a guest. Thomas Bear dismounted and lifted her down with impersonal courtesy, then spoke to his people in rapid Lakota. She caught only one word repeated several times that sounded like Wanspaki, which she would later learn meant teacher. An older woman approached, her weathered face marked by deep lines of laughter and sorrow both. She wore traditional dress, beautifully beaded, her gray-streaked hair in long braids. Thomas Bear introduced her as Winona, his aunt, who managed his household. She studied Margaret with sharp eyes that missed nothing, taking in the too-thin frame, the faded dress, the careful way Margaret held herself as though expecting a blow. Winona said something in Lakota that made Thomas Bear respond sharply, a hint of warning in his voice. Winona's expression softened. She reached out and touched Margaret's cheek with surprising gentleness, then gestured for her to follow. They walked through the encampment, past curious faces and whispered conversations, to a well-built log cabin that stood slightly apart from the other dwellings. Thomas Bear explained that it had been the reservation agent's house before the current agent had moved to Billings, claiming the location was too remote for his comfort. Inside, the cabin was simple but solid, with a main room containing a fireplace, a table, and chairs, and 2 smaller rooms beyond. One would be Margaret's, Thomas Bear said. The other belonged to Winona, who would stay with her until she felt comfortable. Margaret set down her carpet bag and looked around the space that would be her home, unable to quite believe this was real. Through the window, she could see the encampment spreading across the valley, smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing near the river. It looked nothing like Boston, nothing like the life she had known. Thomas Bear stood in the doorway, backlit by the lowering sun. He said that she should rest today and settle in. Tomorrow he would bring the children who needed teaching. If she changed her mind, he would arrange for someone to take her back to Billings with enough money for passage east. No obligation would bind her here against her will. The words struck Margaret with unexpected force. No obligation. No threat. Simply a choice offered and respected. She nodded, not trusting her voice. That evening, Winona brought food, a stew rich with meat and wild turnips, bread made from government-issue flour. They ate in silence that was somehow comfortable, communicating through gestures and smiles when words failed. After dinner, Winona began teaching Margaret basic Lakota phrases. How for hello among men, hand for women's greetings. Pilamaya for thank you. Toksharake for goodbye. Margaret repeated the words carefully, stumbling over unfamiliar sounds. Winona corrected her with patience, and when Margaret finally pronounced something correctly, the older woman's face creased with approval. Later, lying on a rope bed with actual blankets instead of the thin boarding house sheets, Margaret listened to unfamiliar sounds outside. Someone played a flute, the melody haunting and beautiful. Dogs barked in the distance. Voices murmured in the language she did not yet understand. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long remained, but it had been joined by something else, something fragile and tentative. She had expected to feel more afraid here among people so different from herself, but instead she felt safer than she had in years. Thomas Bear's steady presence, Winona's unexpected kindness, the way they had asked rather than demanded, all of it suggested that perhaps this desperate gamble might become something more than mere survival. Sleep came slowly. Margaret's mind circled the strangeness of her situation. 24 hours ago she had been waiting for a dead man at a train station. Now she lay in a cabin on a Lakota reservation, preparing to teach children she had never met in a language she barely spoke herself. It should have been terrifying. Perhaps it was. But terror had many faces, and the known horrors of her marriage had taught her that sometimes the greatest danger wore a familiar face and slept beside you at night. Thomas Bear was a stranger, yes, and his world was foreign to her in every way. But he had looked at her and seen a person in need, had offered help without expectation of payment beyond honest work. That simple decency was more than Thomas Whitmore had ever shown her in 5 years of marriage. As consciousness finally slipped away, Margaret realized she had made it through an entire day without flinching at a raised voice or tensing at a sudden movement. It was a small thing, perhaps, but for a woman who had forgotten what peace felt like, it was enough to build a fragile hope upon. The first teaching day arrived with morning frost painting the grass silver. Margaret woke to unfamiliar sounds, roosters crowing and horses nickering, voices calling to each other in Lakota. She dressed carefully in her grey wool dress, pinned her brown hair into a severe bun, and tried to steady her nervous hands. Winona appeared with breakfast, strong coffee, and fried bread with honey, then helped her arrange the cabin's main room into something resembling a schoolroom. They pushed the table against the wall and brought in logs for children to sit on. Winona produced precious paper and pencils, explaining through gestures that Thomas Bear had obtained them in Billings yesterday. Margaret realized he must have known she would say yes before she did. The thought unsettled and reassured her in equal measure. He had seen her desperation but also something else, some quality that made him believe she would stay. The children arrived mid-morning, 12 of them ranging from perhaps 6 to 14 years old. They entered shyly, clustering together, watching Margaret with open curiosity. Thomas Bear came with them, introducing each child by name. There was Zitkala, a girl of 8 with braids so long they nearly touched the floor. Tatanka, a serious boy of 12 who watched everything with solemn eyes. Little Chaske, barely 6, who hid behind his older sister's skirts. Others whose names Margaret struggled to catch and remember. Thomas Bear spoke to the children in Lakota, his voice firm but kind, explaining what they would learn and why it mattered. Margaret heard the weight behind his words, the urgency. He was preparing them for a world that would demand they speak English, that would punish them for their own language in the boarding schools where the government wanted to send them. Teaching them here, on their own land, in a place where their language and culture could exist alongside the English, was an act of resistance disguised as cooperation. The first lesson was chaos. Margaret knew nothing about teaching children, especially children who spoke a different language. She started with simple words, pointing to objects and saying their English names. Table. Chair. Window. Door. The children repeated dutifully, but their eyes glazed with boredom. By noon, Margaret was exhausted and discouraged, certain she had failed spectacularly. But the next day the children returned. And the day after that. Gradually, patterns emerged. Margaret discovered that stories worked better than rote memorization. She would act out simple tales, using exaggerated gestures, and the children would laugh and engage, picking up vocabulary naturally. Zitkala proved especially quick, translating for the younger ones when they got confused. Tatanka asked questions constantly, wanting to understand not just words but the ideas behind them. Little Chaske gradually emerged from his shyness, his face lighting up when he successfully repeated a new phrase. Thomas Bear came most afternoons to check their progress. He would sit quietly in the corner, observing without interfering, his presence somehow making the cabin feel smaller and the air slightly thinner. Margaret found herself increasingly aware of him, of the way he moved with economical grace, of his low voice when he spoke to the children in Lakota, of the rare smile that transformed his usually serious face. She told herself this awareness was natural, that he was simply the person responsible for her being here, that gratitude was making her notice things she should ignore. But the truth pressed against her consciousness during the long evenings when she reviewed lessons and he sometimes stopped by to discuss the children's progress. They would talk about teaching strategies, about which children needed extra help, about the balance between honoring Lakota ways and preparing them for white institutions. These conversations inevitably expanded into deeper territory, sharing stories about their lives before this moment. Thomas Bear spoke of his childhood, of learning to hunt with his father, of the buffalo that no longer thundered across the plains, of watching his people forced onto shrinking reservation land. Margaret found herself sharing things she had never told anyone. About her father, who had drunk himself to death when she was 15. About her mother, dead 2 years later of what the doctor called pneumonia but Margaret knew was simply giving up. About Thomas Whitmore, who had seemed charming during their brief courtship but revealed his true nature 3 days after their wedding. She did not share everything, could not yet speak of the worst moments, but Thomas Bear seemed to understand what she left unsaid. His face grew hard when she mentioned her husband's temper, harder still when she unconsciously touched her ribs where they had been broken and healed crooked. He did not offer empty platitudes or tell her she should have left sooner. He simply listened with focused attention that felt like being truly seen for the first time in her life. These evening conversations became the part of Margaret's day she anticipated most, though she knew such anticipation was dangerous. She was a white woman on a Lakota reservation, a temporary solution to a specific problem. When the children no longer needed her, she would leave. Building anything here would be foolish. Yet something was building despite her better judgment. It showed in small gestures. Winona began teaching her to prepare traditional foods, smiling with approval when Margaret learned to clean and cook prairie turnips. The children started seeking her out outside lessons, bringing her things they found, pretty stones and feathers, offerings that felt like acceptance. Thomas Bear brought her books from Billings, volumes on history and poetry that he must have traveled hours to acquire. She caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she could not quite decipher, something tender and troubled at once. The reservation began to feel less foreign. She learned to identify people by name, to return greetings in Lakota, to understand the daily rhythms of life here. The fear that had defined her existence for so long loosened its grip slightly, replaced by a fragile sense of belonging. She still flinched at sudden movements, still woke sometimes in the night convinced Thomas Whitmore had found her. But those moments came less frequently. The healing she had not believed possible was happening almost without her noticing, stitching her torn spirit back together one careful day at a time. Winter announced itself with early snow that blanketed the valley in pristine white. Margaret had been at the reservation for 6 months, long enough that her life in Boston felt like something that had happened to someone else. The teaching had evolved into something deeper than language lessons. The children learned English, yes, but Margaret learned Lakota words and customs in return. She participated in ceremonies she barely understood but felt in her bones, standing beside Winona as the women prepared feasts and honored traditions that stretched back generations. The reservation was not the savage place newspapers had described. It was a community struggling to maintain its identity against crushing pressure to assimilate, families fighting to stay together despite government policies designed to separate them, people holding on to dignity in circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. Margaret had come here desperate and broken. She was finding herself whole again in ways she had not thought possible. Thomas Bear had become central to this transformation, though neither of them spoke of it directly. He appeared at her cabin most evenings now, sometimes with practical reasons like discussing a child's progress, sometimes with gifts like warm buffalo robes for the coming winter, sometimes with no excuse at all. They talked for hours, their conversations ranging from philosophy to practical matters, from painful pasts to uncertain futures. Margaret learned that he had traveled east years ago, had attended a boarding school where teachers beat the Lakota out of children with rulers and fists. He had learned English in white ways, but he had never forgotten who he was. He spoke of his first wife, Red Bird Woman, who had died bringing their stillborn son into the world 3 years past. The grief still lived in his eyes when he mentioned her, but it had softened into something bearable, a scar instead of an open wound. Margaret shared more of her own story, finding safety in his steady presence. She told him about the night Thomas Whitmore had broken her arm, about hiding the injury until it healed wrong, about the 1,000 small cruelties that had taught her to make herself invisible. One evening in late November, as snow fell softly outside, Thomas Bear arrived with news that changed everything. The Indian agent had demanded to see Margaret, to verify she was actually teaching and not involved in some scheme. Thomas Bear's jaw was tight with anger he tried to control. The agent was a petty man who resented any arrangement he had not personally approved. He would make trouble if he could. Margaret should prepare for questions, possibly hostile ones. She felt the old fear surge up, the instinct to hide, to placate, to make herself small. But something else rose up too, something that had grown strong during her months here. She had found purpose in teaching these children, had discovered she was good at it. She had made a place for herself in this community. She would not let a small-minded bureaucrat destroy what she had built. Thomas Bear saw the determination in her face, and his expression shifted from worry to something else, something that made her breath catch. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. This was the first time he had touched her beyond helping her dismount from a horse. The contact sent electricity up her arm. He spoke carefully, each word deliberate. He said that he had not expected her to stay beyond a few weeks. He had thought she would find the reservation too difficult, the work too hard, his people too foreign. But she had proven stronger than he imagined, more adaptable, more committed to the children than any white teacher he had known. She had earned respect here through her actions, not her words. The people saw her dedication. They noticed how she lived simply, asked for nothing, gave generously of her time and energy. Winona spoke of her with affection. The children loved her. He paused, and in that pause Margaret heard everything he was not saying. His hand tightened around hers. He said that if she wished to stay permanently, there were ways to make that happen. Ways that would protect her from the agent's interference, ways that would give her a permanent place in the community. He could speak to the tribal council. They could make arrangements. His voice remained carefully neutral, but his eyes burned with an intensity that made Margaret's heart race. She understood what he was offering without him saying it directly. Marriage. A real place here. A future built on something more solid than temporary necessity. Margaret's first instinct was fear. She had sworn never to marry again, never to give another man power over her life. But Thomas Bear was not Thomas Whitmore. He had shown her only respect and kindness. He had given her space to heal, had never demanded anything beyond honest work. The way he looked at her now held desire, yes, but also something deeper. Recognition. Partnership. A meeting of equals who had both survived their own private wars and found unexpected solace in each other. She thought of the months she had spent here, of how her body had slowly relaxed, how the constant tension in her shoulders had eased, how she smiled now without thinking about it first. She thought of evenings like this one, talking with him while snow fell outside, feeling seen and valued in ways she had forgotten were possible. She thought of the children and their futures, of Winona's patient teaching, of the community that had accepted her despite every reason not to. She thought of going back to Billings, to the hostile stares and limited options, to being alone again with only her fear for company. She met Thomas Bear's eyes and saw her own reflection there, someone stronger than the broken woman who had arrived 6 months ago. She said yes, her voice steady and sure. Relief flooded his face, followed by a joy so pure it transformed him. He stood, pulling her up with him, and cupped her face in his hands with a gentleness that made her throat tight with emotion. He said he would do everything in his power to keep her safe, to give her the life she deserved, to honor the gift she was giving him and his people. Then he kissed her, soft and careful, as though she was something precious that might break. Margaret kissed him back, tasting tears she had not realized she was crying, tears of release and relief and hope. For the first time since Thomas Whitmore had shown her his true face on their honeymoon night, Margaret let herself believe that she might actually be safe. That love might be something tender instead of terrible. That the life spreading out before her, however uncertain, held possibility instead of pain. They married 3 weeks later in a ceremony that blended white and Lakota traditions. Margaret wore a simple dress of soft white doeskin that Winona and the other women had made for her, decorated with intricate beadwork in blue and white. Thomas Bear wore traditional regalia, his strong features painted with symbols Margaret was learning to understand. The tribal council gave their blessing. A white minister from Billings, surprisingly sympathetic to the reservation, performed the legal ceremony that would protect Margaret from the Indian agent's interference. They exchanged vows in both English and Lakota, promising partnership and respect, love and loyalty. The community celebrated with feasting and dancing that lasted long into the night. Margaret stood beside her new husband, watching children she had taught dance with their families, and felt something she had thought lost forever. She felt at home. She felt beloved. She felt whole. The broken woman who had fled Boston on a westbound train barely existed anymore. In her place stood someone new, someone who had discovered that healing was possible, that love could be tender, that strength could be found in unexpected places. Thomas Bear pulled her close as the celebration continued around them, his arms a shelter instead of a prison, and Margaret finally understood that she had not lost herself by coming here. She had found herself at last.